In this video, we are going to discuss 5 exegetical fallacies commonly used to make the Bible appear to support evangelical doctrines, such as original sin and PSA. Hello, I'm JC Lamont, and this is Deconstruct and Level Up. On this channel, we debunk evangelical doctrines using evangelicals' own rules of hermeneutics. This ensures that our doctrines align with the historical faith passed down once for all, and that they are exegetical according to the literal, grammatical, historical method of interpretation. All right, let's dive into the 5 exegetical fallacies used by evangelicals to support doctrines such as original sin and penal substitution. Exegetical fallacy number 1, genre fallacy. This fallacy occurs when the genre is not taken into consideration. So, for instance, the law, anything that God said in the law or one of Paul's epistles needs to be taken very straightforward, in a very straightforward manner. However, the Psalms or the writings need to be understood to contain metaphor, similes, hyperbole, various things like that. And so a doctrine should never be built on a psalm that has no support in any other genre, in the law or the history or the epistles or the gospels. If all of the verses that support this doctrine are found only in the Psalms or in other poetic passages in the prophets, then there is a problem, because the poetry is a reflection of the scriptures. They're not, they might be messianic in that they are predictive of Jesus' death, like Psalm 22, but they're not going to introduce new concepts or contradict anything found in the law. So if, for example, if Isaiah 53, which is known as a servant song, it is poetic. If it seems to contradict something in the law, then we need to re-examine how we're interpreting Isaiah 53, because Isaiah is expressing poetry about Leviticus 16. He's not changing the law. He is not saying, oh, this is what the sacrifice is doing. So if in Leviticus 16, if you have 2 goats, if the goat who has the sins confessed over him lives, and Isaiah 53 appears to be saying that the servant has the sins laid on him and is slaughtered because of those sins, then there's something wrong with how we're understanding Isaiah 53. And we need to re-examine Isaiah 53, not reinterpret Leviticus 16 through the lens of Isaiah 53. And we will get into a whole episode, or possibly several episodes, deconstructing Isaiah 53 to see that it actually does align perfectly with Leviticus 16. But that's an entirely different episode. But that type of fallacy is known as a genre fallacy, and that is one example. Another example would be using the Psalms to support the concept of original sin. Now, we haven't deconstructed original sin yet, but very, very briefly, the difference between what the Jews and the early church and the Catholics and the Greek Orthodox believed and versus what Protestants believe is that a person is born morally neutral, and they become a sinner when they choose to sin. In the Protestant original sin concept, you are a sinner in the womb, and you sin because you're a sinner. You don't become a sinner when you sin. And this concept comes from God saying, choose for yourselves this day. Are you going to live? Are you going to die? Choose life. Don't choose death. The Jews extrapolated the concept that they have the choice to choose between good or evil, sinner by choice, from the scripture. Luther believed that there was no choice, there was no free will, and that you were free only to choose evil. Now, Wayne Grudem, in his systematic theology, I think it's the most popular systematic theology in evangelical seminaries and colleges. So that's the textbook that your pastor was taught. Reiterates this. He says, we don't have the freedom that's the most important freedom that we would need. I'll quote it properly. And that's a very Protestant idea, that we do not have the freedom to choose good. We only have the freedom to choose the wrong thing. So, and the scriptures that he pulls from are in the Psalms. He doesn't pull from any of the verses in the law that say you have a choice. Choose life, don't choose death. Ezekiel, Deuteronomy. I mean, the overflowing amount of passages that in which God declares that we have a choice are not used, obviously, because they don't support sinner by nature. And the main verses that they use to support the notion of sinner by nature are from the Psalms. And one of the things about the Psalms is they use hyperbole. So the first verse they use is when David, I think it's Psalm 51:3 or 51:5, says, I was conceived in iniquity, I was born in sin, or conceived in sin and born in iniquity. And this is when he is lamenting his affair with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband, so that he did not get caught. And he is genuinely remorseful, and he is confessing his sins to God in this psalm. And he is using hyperbole, and we know this because he's not introducing the concept of sinner by nature. We know this because not a single Jew, no Second Temple literature, and the Jews to this day have never interpreted Psalm 51 to be overthrowing the idea of free choice and introducing the concept of sinner by nature. It was still sinner by choice. The early church never interpreted this passage to be proving or introducing the concept of sinner by nature. The early church believed in sinner by choice. They believed it all the way up until Augustine tried to introduce the concept of sinner by nature, and the church rejected it. And they continued to believe in sinner by choice. The Greek Orthodox continued to believe in sinner by choice, and it wasn't until Luther resurrected this concept and made it official even Protestant doctrine. So this is why you're finding it in Protestant textbooks. So David is expressing his sorrow, and he is expressing his remorse, and he is using very hyperbolic, exaggerated language, like I was born in iniquity, I was conceived in sin, I've been, basically he's expressing his frustration that he's born in a sinful world, he's been sinful from as long as he can remember, but he's not introducing the concept that he was sinner by nature in the womb. Even more obvious example of hyperbole used in the Psalms and used by Wayne Grudem to support the notion of original sin is, the wicked are estranged from the womb, they go astray from birth, speaking lies. And this is Psalm 58:3. So no infant is speaking lies from birth. This is clearly hyperbole. What the psalmist is expressing is that the wicked choose to become sinners very young. But he is not, again, introducing the concept of sinner by nature. And we absolutely know this because even Martin Luther knew it. When he introduced the concept of original sin, he said he knew that that is not how the Jews interpreted it, or the early church, or the scholastics, which was one of his derogatory terms for the Catholics. So he even knew it. So it shouldn't be contested or There's no legitimate grounds to contest it, at least. Okay, so that's your genre fallacy number one. And there are other passages, such as Romans, that are used to support the concept of original sin, and we will get into that when we deconstruct original sin. But for now, that's just exegetical fallacy number one, genre fallacy. All right, exegetical fallacy number two, hyper-literalism. This is when a verse is taken far more literally than the author meant. So, for instance, when the wise men came to see Jesus and they stopped at Herod's palace first, they told Herod that we're looking for the newborn king of the Jews. Can you help us find him? So now they go off to follow the star, and the verse says, all Jerusalem was worried with Herod. Now, all Jerusalem does not include infants. The infants aren't in their little swaddling clothes at home, worried about the wise men claiming there's a new king of the Jews with Herod. They're not. It means all in Herod's court. It means all in Jerusalem who saw the wise men come, but it does not mean every single last person in Jerusalem. Okay, so that same Greek word translated all in that verse is also the word translated in Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That passage is also used to say all, as in every single infant, is already a sinner. Even though they haven't chosen to sin, even though they haven't committed a personal sin, they have already sinned. Now, this is going to really go into original sin and go back to they sinned in Adam. And again, that's for deconstructing. But this is an example of hyper-literalism. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that Paul does introduce the concept of original sin in an epistle. He doesn't do it in Romans 3:23, though. Okay, that because you have to commit an exegetical fallacy for him to do so, and David doesn't do it in Psalm 53 or the other psalm. Those psalms aren't supporting that doctrine. So even if that doctrine is true, those verses don't support it because they're committing exegetical fallacies according to evangelicals' own rules of hermeneutics. All right, exegetical fallacy number 3. This one doesn't actually support a doctrine, but I'm going to throw it out there because I think it's relevant because it is supposedly the most commonly used erroneous hermeneutic, and that hermeneutic it has been labeled the devotional hermeneutic, and that is when you take a verse completely out of its context and apply it to yourself. The most common one of this is, for I know the plans I have for you, plans not to harm you, plans to give you a future. That verse is slapped on graduation cards and purses and journals and t-shirts, and it's all about how God has plans for you personally, and those plans will not harm you. They're plans to give you a future. Now imagine the high school graduate who gets that card and then dies in a horrible car accident. How could that happen if God had great plans for his future and plans not to harm him? What if the high school graduate goes off to war, joins the army and goes off to war and is horribly harmed? What if all the things that could go wrong. all the things in life that could go wrong, and then suddenly that verse is false. Oh, well, that verse is false. Look at what happened. Well, if that verse is false, how many other Bible verses are false? Okay, well, we can't trust the Bible. Well, why should we trust God? Let's just be an atheist. If we commit an exegetical fallacy like that, especially with children, teenagers, and young adults, we are setting them up to view the Bible as false and God's promises as untrue. And that's one of the things that is so dangerous about the devotional hermeneutic. Now, what that passage was saying is Israel, the first temple Israel, was going into captivity because of their sins. Now, usually when one country came in and conquered another country and took them captive, they were assimilated into that country, meaning intermarriage was forced upon that people group. And so the men are marrying, the conquering men are taking wives from the captives until the bloodline is so mixed that they aren't a distinct people group anymore. Now, the problem with this, with Judaism, is that the Messiah was promised to be Jewish. So if he has more Assyrian blood in him than Jewish blood, then the scripture cannot be fulfilled. So the Jews are going to be extremely concerned as they go into captivity. Like, are we being annihilated? Are we being assimilated? Are we going to survive this? Are we ever going to come back? Or the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem? Did that happen already? Yeah, Micah. Yeah, see, all of these prophets, like, what's going to happen is everything that we've been promised gone and lost forever. Did we so utterly fail that the Messiah isn't even coming? And no, God was saying, no, I have a future planned for you. A future to give you hope, a future to restore you. I will bring you back to your land, and the Messiah will still come from you. So that is what that verse is about in context, and God fulfilled it. So when we take that verse and we apply it to every single graduate or every single person looking for a spouse or every single college applicant looking to get into the college of their choice, we're setting God up to fail them. And that is going to lead to incredible discouragement and this idea that the Bible can't be trusted. So don't do a devotional hermeneutic. All right, exegetical fallacy number 4. Okay, this is a semantic fallacy, and we're going to call it misdefinition. So this is when you apply the wrong definition to a word. So let's say, here's an example. My pet is small and fluffy. She has whiskers and she meows, and her scientific name is canine, and the layman term is dog. Okay, well, that's misdefinition. That's a semantic fallacy. The animal being described does not fit, is not the definition of the word canine or the word dog. That would be cat and feline. So that's a semantic fallacy. You cannot do that. Well, I mean, you can, but you're going to get a different understanding of what the text meant if you do that. So for instance, we'll look at Hebrews 9:22. The second half of Hebrews 9:22. There is a first half of Hebrews 9:22 that isn't quoted near as often with the second half, but we will do that when we look at that verse for other hermeneutic errors. The number of hermeneutic errors in Hebrews 9:22 is interesting. Okay, so right now we're just looking at semantic fallacy. So without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. So what do we mean when we say forgiveness? Well, from a PSA context, what is meant in this passage is reconciliation. And the definition of reconciliation is restoration of favor. So without the shedding of blood, there is no restoration of favor between humanity and God. So God and humanity are separate. Sin separates them, and without the shedding of blood, without a sacrifice, there is no restoration. God cannot be restored to you. God's favor towards you cannot be restored until blood is shed, until a sacrifice is made. Now, the problem with that is that the sacrifice is, in PSA, a penalty, okay? It is penal. It is the punishment for sin. So in other words, shedding of blood means without the punishment of sin, or without sin being punished, there is no restoration of favor. Well, the problem here is that the Greek word translated forgiveness is not katalage. Katalage means restoration of favor. It is usually translated reconciliation. The word is actually aphasis, and aphasis means cancellation of the penalty. Well, if the definition cancel of the penalty is applied to this verse, the verse becomes nonsensical, because now the verse is saying without sin being punished, there is no cancellation of the punishment. That doesn't make any sense. The punishment is either canceled or it's not canceled. So because their doctrine, the doctrine of PSA, requires the shedding of blood to be penal, then they must change the definition of forgiveness. So they attach the definition of katalage to aphasis. And I don't think they do this consciously. I would like to give them the benefit of the doubt. But that's basically the concept. Without sin being punished, there is no restoration of favor. But that's not what the verse says. The verse says without the shedding of blood, there is no cancellation of the penalty. This makes us ask ourselves, what does the shedding of blood do? And of course, we've looked into this in other videos, and we will definitely look into it more when we fully dissect the verse, Hebrews 9:22, but we know that the shedding of blood purified us from sin. So with purified, it wiped away our record of sins. So without the wiping away, without the erasing of your record of sins, there is no cancellation of the punishment of those sins. Then, now you are interpreting that word in its cultural understanding. That's what the Jews understood, what the shedding of blood accomplished. The Jews understood that what shed sacrificial blood accomplished was the purging of sin, the wiping away of sin, the cleansing you from sin. The early church understood all of that. So when we keep the early church's understanding, we can keep aphasis' definition attached to it. But when we change what the shedding of blood, what the purpose of that blood, and we change it to the shedding of blood appeases God's wrath, or the shedding of blood is punishment for sin, then we have a problem. Aphasis, now the definition doesn't fit our doctrine, and so we have to change it. Except that's an exegetical fallacy, because you can't choose what definition you want to apply to the Greek word. The Greek word chosen was chosen by the Holy Spirit, and we need to let it have the definition it is supposed to have. Okay, exegetical fallacy number 5. Please like, subscribe, and don't forget, for those who are interested, door number 3, the short-ish story, short novel, novella, whatever you want to call it, is now, the ebook is now available for pre-sale. It is only 99 cents for the first week. Because the 3 categories that the book is listed is atheism, fundamentalism, and Calvinism. And so the more people who buy it in that first week, the more likely it's going to shoot up to the top 10 and maybe even top 1. And then it'll have a little ribbon that says bestseller in Calvinism, bestseller in atheism, bestseller in fundamentalism. One of them, not all 3. But either one, I don't pick it, the algorithm picks it. But that will tell the algorithm to start showing it in all of those categories. And it will, the more people who see it, obviously the more people will buy it. The more people who buy it, the more people who hear the gospel, some maybe for the first time. Until next time, keep standing firm.